I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Patricia King, the General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Patricia is a very well-known social justice advocate in Ireland. People will know her from our news media, from both TV and from the print media. So we're delighted that Patricia has been able to take the time to come and speak here today. So if you could give a warm welcome to Patricia King, please.
Yeah, very good. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to take part and to offer this short address. So I know you've had a full morning on the subject, so the trade union movement has always maintained a very clear and simple view of housing. We see it no more or no less than a public good, and it is as essential to the normal functioning of our society as that of such core services as education and healthcare. And I hope my point on that will become clear as I speak to you. So, what has happened to our housing system originates, the current issue originates back somewhere in the 1980s. And from that time onward, successive administrations have overseen a slow and gradual abandonment of the state's central role in housing provision and the surrender of control over strategic and social economic infrastructure to private interests. And the wider societal considerations around housing have been subordinated to the generation of profit. So, in a previous era, the state and local authorities were equipped with the tools required to address market failure. But devotion to the market has stripped the current and previous administrations of that capacity, and reversing it will require a seismic upending and retreat from the current belief and policy systems which are endemic across officialdom. So over recent years there has been endless commentary, which I don't intend to add to much today, and strong views expressed as to the possible solutions to the housing crisis. Last weekend we had no greater or no lesser luminary than Dermot Desmond offering a big contribution on that in the Irish Times. And we have seen a paradigm shift in public attitudes and the political system struggling to catch up. But the first key policy task of our own Raise the Roof campaign called for an urgent state-led programme of public housing on public land. And I don't think it's unfair to suggest that there is now a clear consensus among all groups that this is the only way forward. But this will necessitate a massive infrastructural public investment and a major policy shift. And turning to the actual theme of this afternoon's session on achieving a right to housing for all in Ireland, that echoes the fifth point, key demand of the Raise the Roof campaign. And that was the right for all to housing. And in my opinion, the incoming administration, whoever they are, should move immediately and make necessary arrangements to hold a referendum, to amend our constitution, to include a right to adequate, secure, safe and affordable housing. And the state, through such an amendment, should be obligated, therefore, to ensure the realisation of that right through its laws and its policies in accordance with the principles of social justice. Now, I make this proposition, I think, for good reasons. Such a right, enshrined in the Constitution, would provide a basic floor of protection, obliging the state to realise this right progressively. And it would mean that all legislation and all policies that are developed would have to be proofed to ensure that the state reasonably protects this right. In other words, it would underpin the basis of policy into the future. And while it does not guarantee every person in the state a home, all future housing policy would have to promote and provide access to appropriate, secure, safe and affordable housing. And as the MUSSI Law Resource Centre report remarks, a right to housing would allow the courts to have judicial review and oversight over whether this basic right is adequately protected. So this is about delivering a social policy based on human rights. And currently in Ireland, there is no right to housing in Irish law. There is no onus or responsibility on the government or local authorities to providing housing. The housing legislation and the Housing Act 1966 right through to 2014 and all of the related regulations attached to it, they define homelessness and they contain certain rights regarding social housing, such as the right to apply for social housing assistance, the right to be assessed for such assistance, and that. But involved in all of that, there is no inherent right to housing, and there is no law. So, at present, the law courts can only review the fairness of the decision-making process, but not the actual decisions of the state and the local authorities. And in these circumstances, successive governments have been in a position to create housing policy which was in step with their own ideologies and not citizens' needs. And accordingly, for decades, we have experienced a failed market-based approach and a dysfunctional housing system. So I am absolutely convinced, based on my knowledge of public policy development through decades of close observance, that the only means of achieving this seismic change necessary vis-à-vis the development of a balanced public housing policy and the urgent requirement for swift delivery is through a constitutional amendment which will leave policy developers and implementers with no choice but to realise this right. And I say that, I'll just expand a little bit, I say that very advisedly, because there are very, very good people working in the official system, very good people who work in the administration. And they operate to make sure that they implement policy that they are required to do in law. So we have an education system where a constitution says every child is entitled to. So you get an education system which attempts to address all of that because the law says it should do it. You've had very large, long cases brought to the Supreme Court challenging the education system that said, for instance, in one very public case, that said, for instance, that my need for education is not being met because I have particular special needs and the education system is not meeting them as an individual. And you have the Supreme Court who made judgments relating to that, saying the education system policy development is geared towards meeting the needs. There might be particular exigencies that have to be adjusted or addressed to meet everyone's needs, but the right in the Constitution is being met. But we've had all of that scrutiny go through the courts. None of that is required in housing. None of it. So the policy makers and indeed the policy implementers don't have to meet that mark. They don't have to meet that mark. Now there will be a lot of people say, why didn't they do this? Why do we have to? We look back in all of the legislation between 1966 and 2014, we haven't got that piece of legislation. Well, there you have it. That's a big deficiency in the system. But the deficiency in the system, whether it was well practiced, well thought out, done on purpose or by oversight, I'm not going to make a comment about that, but I am going to say that I know there is a mega hole in the system. And with the best will in the world, with the best intellect in the world, with the best people in the system doing the business, if they don't have to meet the bottom line of a piece of legislation, you will not get the return. And I am saying, if we want to change, and any set of political parties, whoever they are, that form the next administration, if they want to put this right, they're going to have to do that. They're going to have to do it. So it's worth noting that this right is enshrined in Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it already exists in countries such as Belgium, Finland, Netherlands and Spain. And the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has noted that the right to adequate housing should not be interpreted in a narrow or restrictive sense, and should be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, peace and dignity. And also, our own Constitutional Convention in 2014, 84% of the participants said this should happen. So, any income administration must give serious consideration and put value on introducing this and having this. By the way, just as an aside, if they were going to do that referendum, they should also do the water piece in it as well, to make sure that that doesn't fall into private, so that we don't have another broadband episode going on, because in generations to come, it probably won't affect me, but in generations to come, that will be something that we'll all be regarded as having failed if we don't keep that within the ownership of the state, in other words, within the ownership of the people. So the government should acknowledge the deficiencies and present this system and assert their willingness to take the necessary giant steps to resolve the crisis. They are ideally placed coming in a new administration to do this and to instigate this amendment process, and in my view, not to do so would be unconscionable. Thank you very much for listening to me.